Welcome back to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. We are looking at a highly consequential, frankly massive moment in global security that just unfolded at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. Now, if you're not familiar, this is basically the world's premier defense summit. It's where top military leaders and diplomats get together to hash out the future of international relations. And this year, literally all eyes were on the United States. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth took the stage to outline a newly shifting U.S. defense strategy, one that is actively attempting to balance some incredibly complex military challenges with delicate diplomatic realities. If you want to understand exactly where global power dynamics are heading right now, this speech is the blueprint.
Hegseth's core philosophy regarding the Pacific balance of power is perfectly encapsulated in his own words. We do not approach this challenge with needless confrontation, but with a posture of measured and deliberate strength. In his speech, he definitely expressed some rightful alarm regarding China's historic military buildup. The U.S. goal, he noted, is to prevent any single hegemon from unraveling the regional balance of power. But you've got to notice the specific phrasing he chose here, measured and deliberate strength, as opposed to needless confrontation. The U.S. is clearly signaling that it wants to maintain equilibrium, not instigate chaos. It's a very specific rhetorical tightrope, right? Projecting serious power without accidentally triggering a conflict.
So, to understand exactly how they plan to walk that tightrope, here is the geopolitical chessboard we're unpacking today. 1. China, rival, not enemy. 2. The NATO commitment. 3. Taiwan, the red line. And 4. The media crackdown. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1. China, rival, not enemy. It's an absolute balancing act. The dynamic between Washington and Beijing is actively being redefined right now, and communication is paramount. Let's walk through a little cause and effects, because the timeline of events here shows exactly why everyone got a major wake-up call. Back in October, the U.S. imposed heightened tariffs. Well, in the months that followed, China retaliated by withholding critical minerals from the U.S. Fast forward a few weeks, and that lack of communication and tit-for-tat escalation essentially brought entire sectors of the U.S. economy to its knees. It pushed the relationship to the absolute brink. So the renewed military-to-military communications we're seeing at present are a direct, urgent attempt to rectify those past misunderstandings before things spiral into an economic or military disaster. Now, what's really interesting about this is just how personal the diplomacy has become to actually enforce that communication. Just 2 weeks ago at a summit in Beijing, right before leaving, President Trump reportedly told Xi Jinping directly, "Call me." Basically, if there are issues, pick up the phone. It's a very clear top-down attempt to redefine the working relationship. And guess what? It worked. Those active military-to-military communication channels have indeed been restored, and they're acting as a much-needed pressure valve for rising tensions. You know, this shift in political and military strategy is actually mirroring a fascinating shift in the American public, too. Recent Pew Research data reveals a total paradigm shift in how Americans perceive China. People are moving away from viewing China as an enemy, a foe that requires direct confrontation, and instead they're starting to view China as a rival. A rival is a competitor you can coexist with. It's a subtle word change, but a defining moment, because it gives policymakers the runway they need to pursue that measured strength rather than gearing up for an outright conflict. Let's pivot our focus over to Europe for Section 2, the NATO commitment, sharing the burden. At the summit, Defense Secretary Hegseth took a fairly pointed swipe at NATO, stating there are great benefits for allies that help themselves. Now, if you're looking for panic from European allies over that, you're just not going to find it. Contrast Hegseth's pointed rhetoric with what the NATO military chief said on the sidelines of the exact same summit. He said, "We don't have any drama going on. We are on that path." He noted that the U.S. message was actually received loud and clear a long time ago. So from his perspective, the alliance remains mature, stable, and completely drama-free as they methodically adapt to current challenges. And what exactly is that path the NATO military chief is talking about? Well, it's a specific, ambitious target, 5% by 2035. European nations are actively listening to President Trump's calls for them to contribute a much larger percentage of their GDP to defense. They have actually committed to reaching a 5% defense spending target by the year 2035. Now, as the NATO chief pointed out, that is not going to happen overnight, but the defense planning process is absolutely in motion to acquire those capabilities. So why does all of this matter? Because despite the political friction and the very public pushes for higher defense budgets, a U.S.-led response literally cannot act completely alone.
The US inherently relies on its NATO allies in Europe, just as it relies on its partners in the Indo-Pacific to counter massive global military buildups, like the one we are seeing from China. At the end of the day, these alliances are absolutely non-negotiable for global equilibrium.
Now, let's move to the climax of our explainer. Section 3, Taiwan, the red line.
For all the talk of alliances at the summit, there was a glaring, massive omission in Defense Secretary Hegseth's prepared speech. He did not mention Taiwan once, not a single time. And keep in mind, last year, he mentioned it 5 times. So the crucial point is, why the sudden silence? Because Taiwan is the ultimate red line. China has warned time and time again that Taiwan is the strictest boundary in U.S.-China relations. If the situation is mismanaged or crossed, it carries severe, world-altering geopolitical consequences. The fact that Hegseth entirely avoided the topic in his prepared remarks is a massive indicator of just how incredibly sensitive the U.S. is being toward this specific issue right now.
But of course, he couldn't escape it entirely. Let's walk through what happened during the Q&A segment, because it was really revealing. First, Hegseth was directly asked about a pending, highly scrutinized arms sale to Taiwan. Second, instead of outlining a clear Department of Defense stance, he completely punted and deferred the decision to President Trump. And third, this leaves us with massive ambiguity. Experts are currently debating, are these arms sales being paused because U.S. stockpiles are legitimately running low and are needed at home? Or are they being intentionally held back as a bargaining tactic in broader negotiations with China? Hegseth refusing to answer directly just keeps everyone guessing.
Which brings us to Section 4, the media crackdown and the real-world fallout. These shifting diplomatic red lines and intentional ambiguities don't just happen in a vacuum. They have immediate real-world consequences on the ground, which leads us to this stark development. China recently expelled Vivian Wang, a long-standing, highly accomplished reporter for the New York Times. The trigger? The outlet had recently published an interview with the president of Taiwan. Now, historically, China has actually been relatively tolerant of American media outlets conducting interviews with Taiwanese officials. This expulsion marks a sudden, severe break from that precedent, coming directly on the heels of the Trump-Xi summit.
When you start putting the pieces together, the total omission in the speech, the deferred arms sales, the expelled reporter, analysts are pointing to some major implications. We are likely witnessing a total reassessment of how the U.S. views Taiwan. There is a growing theory that under the current administration, Taiwan may simply no longer be the top primary issue in U.S.-China policy. It might be taking a back seat to larger bilateral trade or security issues. And right now, there is a total lack of clarity on how the rest of the world should even respond to a shift like that. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. We've seen the U.S. reframe China as a rival to be managed rather than an enemy. We've seen NATO push to foot much more of the bill. But looking at the shifting alliances, the purposely deferred arms sales, and the immediate expulsion of journalists who cross these newly enforced red lines, what is the actual U.S. policy towards Taiwan right now? Is this strategic ambiguity a brilliant negotiating tactic or a dangerous void? It's a question the global chessboard is desperately waiting to see answered. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Stay focused, keep learning, and I'll see you on the next explainer.